All right. Up next, we're going to have a real interesting talk. This will be a talk about bringing Node in the enterprise and how one engineer or a group of engineers kind of sold it internally. And so the speaker tonight is Daniel, and I'll let you handle your last name from Green Dot. So.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Yeah, so I'm Daniel Imrie-Situnayake. There'll be a test at the end. Basically, I'm here from a company called Green Dot, and I'm going to be telling you a short little story about how we've basically been promoting Node within our company. And Green Dot is not just any startup, but we're like a pretty huge company with some pretty high stakes. So the start of this story is basically around this time last year. I worked at a company called Looped. I don't know if anybody knows the name. So Looped were one of the earliest location-based social networks. So back in the days of feature phones, they had apps where you could see where your friends are on a map and like find out what's going on. So like by last year, we had a whole load of other stuff. We had apps on iOS, Android, and mobile web. We're still a small company, around 30 employees, and we based on like a Microsoft backend and a sort of Rails web stack is what I worked on, and some Node stuff too. And we all have Macs, apart from a few people. And then we were acquired by Green Dot, who really couldn't be more different. They're the company that invented prepaid debit cards. So if you don't know what one of those is, you go into Walgreens, buy this debit card off the shelf, then you can put money on it like at the till. And basically, if you don't have a bank account for whatever reason, like you can't afford the fees or you don't have good enough credit, that's what Green Dot's main product was. They have about 500 employees. They're based down in Southern California, and they're really experts in like retail and finance. So like they build amazing products in amazing packaging and sell them to people with like big television advertising campaigns and stuff. Like, but you couldn't get further from what we're doing. And it's also a highly regulated industry. Like when you're looking after other people's money, you've got a whole lot of extra scrutiny. And then they were pretty much Microsoft only. I think there are like a few designers who have Macs, like just holding on there. But so the reason Green Dot acquired Looped was to build this new product, which is just out in beta like last month. It's called GoBank, and it's basically a next generation checking account. So the idea is that instead of having a kind of bank account with Chase, where for some reason it's tied up to like a physical branch that you sometimes have to go into, and it's a pain in the ass, and they've got really high fees if you don't earn above a certain amount and all these things. We basically built a mobile-centric banking platform. So we've got native apps and soon a mobile web app that basically let you do all your banking from the palm of your hand. So the reason they sort of acquired Loop was we brought a lot of the knowledge with us on how to achieve that. And within Looped at the time of the acquisition, we were using Node.js for a couple of things. Firstly, for some internal tools, and we've been using for about a year, basically building out this foundation of our internal tool platform that does stuff like monitoring performance and letting developers look at device logs in a central place. And then additionally, we were sort of partway through prototyping a new product, which was a mobile web product, which basically we're using Node as a backend for. And we had a few reasons that it's the same ones everyone throws around. Like, oh yeah, there's no context switching. It's faster than Rails for the kind of apps we were building, because we were doing like client-heavy JavaScript stuff, lots of Ajax, and it's just sort of more suited to that kind of application lifecycle. So we're this little tiny company, really, that we're building a social network. And then we were acquired by Green Dot, which is a much bigger very different company with a different structure and way of doing things. And both of us are kind of beholden to these big guys, the Federal Reserve. Because when you're a bank, which Green Dot is a bank holding company, so all of the accounts we offer are FDIC insured, which means that the government's going to bail us out or bail you out if we lose your money. And because of that, because the stakes are so high, like if we screw up, then our company is over really, because the government aren't going to stand for having kind of insecure software leading to all your customers' money getting wiped out. So that really changes things from a perspective of an engineer. Because I think this whole recent like resurgence in like startups in the Bay Area especially has been based around this idea of reducing the gap between engineers and customers to be as small as possible, and basically closing this loop where you've got a problem there and then somebody builds a solution and then you can like show people that solution and see whether it's working, and based on how well it's working you can change that and build some new stuff. And like a lot of what startups do is about this like tight interaction between engineers and designers and customers. But when you get up to the scale of an enterprise company, you've suddenly got all these new people in here, and engineers aren't the center of attention anymore. And that's got a lot of implications, especially like if you're working there, but just for the kind of general way the company works. It's no longer based on engineers driving things, and engineering decisions become less of a part of the whole. So when we think about what we're doing at Green Dot, we're also still using Node for internal tools. But you think like a lot of this stuff goes out of the window, because developer productivity, everybody was writing code in back-end stuff. Like we came along, we have this expertise writing like front-end mobile web things, but really there's no reduced context switching because no one was writing any JavaScript in the first place. It is more performant than ASP.NET MVC for doing this Ajaxy stuff, and there are some benchmarks out there on that which are quite interesting. And you definitely cannot use that as a reason new things are fun. That doesn't fly when you're looking after other people's money. So what it does really represent is part of what Green Dot's been trying to do as a company, is introduce a whole new way of doing things. Part of the logic behind this acquisition and some other choices they've made is that they want to inject some of that like iterative valley mentality into their organization. And so like obviously most of that is organizational, but then the tools you use have a big impact on the way you work and the way your products work. And so Node for us is like part of what represents shorter release cycles, a more lightweight architecture and sort of modular design of different services, a different way of architecting applications. We had web applications before, but they're pretty much standard, like rendered on the server, sent to the client, limited little Ajax interactions. But now we're building some like proper client applications that happen to be written in JavaScript. Lots of Ajax requests. And then a couple of periphery things which are also kind of important is that when you're using an open source platform like Node, you get access to all these free libraries that there are thousands of millions of developer hours every year being poured into creating these things. And you can add immeasurable value to your product by including them. But if you're using a platform like Microsoft.NET, there's loads of cool stuff out there, but there just isn't the volume of like resources that people have been working on. And then to attract the kind of engineers, which isn't to say that Green Dot didn't already have some fantastic engineers working, but there's a certain sort of like product-focused kind of like designy engineer person that they need to do a better job of attracting, and using something like Node or Rails or something that's a bit more sort of the front end of things really helps with recruiting a bit. So it kind of helped that on day one we're already using Node for internal tools, and those tools were things that were going to be useful in the new context at Green Dot. So right from the get-go, we were doing useful stuff. And we also had a prototype of a new mobile web app, which it wasn't even remotely related in purpose, but the kind of framework that we've been building around that was pretty helpful, and transferred over to our new product well. So because of this, we did have some initial champions. So there were engineers within Looped who were like excited about Node, and also there were managers within Looped who were excited about Node, which is probably more important. And then there were plenty of people within Green Dot who'd been like following this new technology. They're excited to hear about it and to experiment. So part of what we did right from the start after the acquisition was to do some evangelism. So we held like an introductory node.js workshop, and we had like one of the big conference rooms in our new building. There's like tons of people showed up. We just sent out an email blast to everyone saying, anyone who's heard about this and is interested and wants to learn a bit, come down. And we targeted at a sort of like light on the technical detail, but giving people a place to get started if they're interested, but also explaining concepts to people who didn't necessarily know much about programming at all. And we had a really big response, and it's quite a nice bit of validation to like come from this startup and you're thinking, oh man, I'm gonna have to fight my ground to use this like trendy tool that everyone thinks is just a bit of fluff. And then you show up and like ask people about it, and everybody comes in and crowds in and wants to see. It's kind of cool. So following on from that, because of the way the acquisition went down and because of the advocacy we'd done, we started to have advocates sort of higher up in the company. And this is really key to what we're doing, because like we're in a big organization now. Engineers are this tiny little part of the system. And without support from above, without business people driving this stuff and seeing the case, it's really not going to go anywhere. And it's important to remember that people who don't write code aren't necessarily going to care about your reasoning why it's going to work better. And like the job you can do to explain it to an engineer is going to be better than a job you can do to explain it to a like business stakeholder. And they really need to know what advantages there are in using Node, rather than the stack that they've been using for years, which has been working fine. They've like grown up to be a $500 million company with the current technologies they're using. So why inject something else? So really, this is like the most important thing. And I think because of this, and just because of like the reality of integrating a new technology that's unfamiliar to an organization, you're going to have some compromise. So hopefully it's not going to be that level of compromise. But things like your architecture, like the way you're designing applications, the platform that your application is using, like we're obviously talking about Node, but this applies anywhere. The operating system that things are running on, tools that you're used to using, your favorite text editor, and your workflow are all going to potentially have to change. So if you look at some of the compromises we've made, whereas we were hosting stuff on Looped on Linux, that's what we're familiar with, that's what everyone knew. But Green Dot has this like massive resource of people who know how to use Microsoft technologies, and we can support Microsoft servers in like a really high uptime, mission critical environment. So we are using Windows to host our Node stuff. And to me, that's like unfamiliar. I don't really have sort of a background there, but like it makes so much more sense for the enterprise in that way. And then similarly, we were writing self-hosting Node programs which are restarted by upstart or something like that if they crash. Instead of that, we're now using IIS Node, which is like a way of hosting Node within IIS. I'm not too big on the technical details of how that works, but it's like out there. A big shift in like the way you think about things is like previously we'd be like, oh wow, this is really cool, check out this library. And like first thing you do is install it, try it out. If it seems to work, push to production, and like it's sweet. But that doesn't work if you're dealing with customers' money. So we've got to get InfoSec approval for all of our libraries that we use. And like, it sounds like a pain in the ass, but it's really not, because now instead of me having to read through that source code and make sure there's no vulnerability I didn't know about, someone else does it for me. So it's like you've got superpowers all of a sudden. And then some things, like we use GitHub to host our like source control, and we use Git as like an integral part of our workflow. And we really didn't want to move from that. So they did have qualms about that, like the sort of security parts of the organization didn't like the idea, but like it shows that people are willing to give and take. We're still using GitHub, kind of put our foot down about that. But to introduce that into our deployment workflow is going to be strange. So now what we do to deploy is check our code out from Git and check it into Perforce branch that is then deployed. So that fits in with how things were working before, but there's still some compromise there. So what you've really got to ask yourselves is, like, if you're trying to introduce a node to your organization, think of the compromises you're going to have to make, because there will be some. And given that level of compromise, does it still even make sense to use Node? And for us, it turns out that it does, because we didn't really have any equivalent tool set that would really fill that role before. But if you're using something else and it's working fine and the compromises are going to be too great, then maybe it isn't going to work. And it's probably good to discover that before you get too far through the process. So all of this stuff is driven by security. And the security is there because our customers trust us with their money. And like, you kind of realize how much of a privilege that is, especially traditionally. A lot of Green Dot's customer base are people who don't have a lot of money at all. And really, if you're thinking about, like, you could be driving through the desert, you're running low on gas, you get to the gas station, pull out your card, and it doesn't work. What are you going to do? Like, if you're writing the next generation photo sharing app, and someone whips out their phone, takes a picture of their dinner, and it doesn't upload, then like, who gives a shit, really? But sorry, but like, when you're dealing with people's money, you have to be doing your job right. And so within big organizations, this is done through procedure, because that's the only way you can have all these people working together to achieve a common goal. And the tools that make up these procedures are generally like documenting stuff, justifying stuff, going through processes, and making sure you're like introspective about this stuff. And I'll go through some of that soon. So like, if you are in an organization, like a bigger organization with these kind of security concerns, you'll have people within the company whose job it is to worry about this stuff. And it's easy, like when we first were a part of Green Dot, to see these guys as adversaries, because they're kind of telling you to stop doing the stuff you've been doing all along, and they're making your life more difficult. Like, it really is true that they make your life more difficult, but they're doing that because they're the customer's advocate within your company, and what you think is making you more productive and getting your job done faster could end up being the thing that brings down a company, puts 500 people out of their jobs, and loses thousands of people, millions of people's savings. So they're really actually on your side. And you kind of, it's important to have a good working relationship with these guys. So even like play board games with them and stuff. And in this like battle to justify everything you're doing, documentation is the most important thing, because that's what's there wherever you are. Like, I mean, one thing that it takes a while to get used to is if you're at a startup and you have an engineering decision that you're making that someone doesn't agree with, you can just go and talk to them. Like, if the CEO has like scratching his head about it, you can go and explain yourself. But that doesn't work in an enterprise, and you're going to have other people advocating for your stance, basically. And so your documentation is what allows them to do that. It's what they can take away and kind of use as ammunition to sort of prove that you're doing the right thing. So we've done stuff like this. There's something called the OWASP Top 10, and it's basically like the top 10 security vulnerabilities in web apps in the wild. And one thing we've done is go through this top 10, and for each of them we've come up with a sort of illustration of how using our kind of node environment and the libraries we're using, what one of those vulnerabilities might look like, and then how we could address it. And this is something like, first of all, it shows that we know what we're doing and we know what we're talking about. And secondly, if there's anyone who doesn't quite know what they're doing, if you have a new hire or someone who's just moved onto the project, they've got something to look through so they know what to look out for in terms of these problems. And some other documents we've written, we've got like developer guidelines, which is again helping people pick stuff up from a blank slate. Then we describe things, how things should work in production, issues people have had kind of in the industry who are using Node at the moment, gotchas and things that could catch you out. And you have to be really honest about the strengths and weaknesses, because these are the things that are going to be used maybe years after you've left the company to help people decide which tool to use for a particular project. So things like coding standards are important. Like, that's a really common concept, but I think it does a lot to bring on board a strange, unfamiliar new technology and put it into terms that are more understandable for people who haven't used it before. It helps legitimize something scary. And all of this basically is about building trust. So you want to show people that you understand what you're doing, that you're genuinely aware of the drawbacks, limitations, and vulnerabilities of this new technology you're promoting, and that you're doing everything you can to mitigate them and apply them correctly. And thinking about this whole thing, I really realized that the process of establishing a new technology within an existing organization is exactly the same as if you're trying to stage a coup. So the first stage is to educate the people. You've got to like whip up some fervor. Then you've got to find some champions like who are going to help drive this thing forward. And then you've got to leadership, because otherwise it's just going to be dead in the water. Then you've got to write yourself a manifesto. So like have something on paper that people can get excited about and show to each other. Then you've got to win over the army, because everyone knows you can't stage a coup without that. And then finally, you're free to build whatever it is you've been looking to build. So in terms of that, if you're interested at all in building Node stuff at a company which has millions of users who trust us with their money, we're building a product that no one's really ever built before, and we're using technologies no one's ever tried to do it with. If that sounds like a challenge you'd be interested in, then check us out. Drop me a line. That's my email address. I'm sure we'd be happy to have you in and show you around. And yeah, that's my details if you want to ask me any questions. But go ahead.
You have native applications, web applications, backend. So do you use some kind of like proprietary protocols for them to talk to each other, or is it like a RESTful API?
Yeah, it's a RESTful API. Well, it's sort of semi-RESTful API using JSON. And then within our backend, there's a lot of different stuff going on. We interface with a lot of third parties as well. So probably if you name a protocol, we're using it somewhere. But the Node stuff is talking in JSON pretty exclusively.
Did you come up with your own coding standards, or did you have something you're referencing?
So the process was basically that we, and I wasn't directly involved with this, but basically we had some of the engineers working on our mobile web product look at the existing coding standards documents that we had for other languages, and then use that exact same format but kind of port it across to Node. So it was a fairly simple task, really. And I think part of it's quite good how we use the existing format, because it makes it a lot less scary. It's like, oh yeah, this is just another programming language. It's not anything fancy, really. Any more questions?
Are you sharing your slide deck?
Oh yeah. I haven't got it shared at the moment, but I'll post it in the meetup chat thing. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, and let me know if you have any more questions.